All right, so hi everyone, and welcome to this session of the COP27 Cascading Climate Risks Virtual Pavilion, organized by the Cascades project, who is a EU Horizon project with a lot of different institutes working on it, including me. And so my name is Claire Mosoni, and I'm a junior researcher in the Finnish Environment Institute in Helsinki. And so in the project, I lead a case study on policy responses to cross-border impacts of climate change in the Arctic, which will be the subject of this session. And so how this session will go is that I will start by presenting this case study for about 10 minutes, and we will then move to a panel discussion with three panelists working on the Arctic, and I hope that will be very, very interesting and insightful for all of you. But so without further ado, let's just start with my presentation. So we decided to do a case study on the Arctic because there the climate change progresses very fast and the impacts are likely to cross borders. And so we want to analyze the coherence between the policies responding to these impacts. And by coherence, we mean that policies support one another, ensuring efficient overall response to climate change in the Arctic. Our focus is mostly on the European Arctic, looking at the response from the EU and the policies of the EU and member states, as well as the interactions with other geographical levels, so the indigenous communities, which are local and also cross-state, Arctic jurisdictional entities, such as the Arctic Council and Arctic states, and other international interests. Our focus in this case study is also on adaptation only, even though sometimes it's difficult to separate it from mitigation, especially in the response. So in this presentation, I will answer three different questions, and we'll start by two that can help us to see how to identify those cross-border impacts and understand how they materialize. So the first one is, what are the different cross-border impact transmission systems in the Arctic, and what policy response needs do they create in the short and medium long term? So first of all, we need to understand what is an impact transmission system. And so it's kind of a conceptual framework that we created within the project. And so it's the way that an initial impact in a region A caused by a climate trigger is transmitted through very different cascading impacts across a border and create a risk in another region, region B, in this theoretical example. And so we used this framework and applied it to the Arctic in order to identify our cross-border impacts. And the result of this is this figure, which I know is looking very, very messy, but basically we've identified 6 different initial impacts caused by warming, and they result in 5 cross-border risks. The first one is risks for energy and transport infrastructure, mostly caused by permafrost thaw that end up in a loss of ground stability, and it is on this unstable ground that infrastructures are vulnerable in the Arctic. And this is a cross-border risks because those energy and transport infrastructure can be important in a global context and be relevant also like for transport from one region to the other, and energy trade also from one region to the other. And we can also have repercussions on the financial markets because of investments in those infrastructures. We then have the risks for indigenous people livelihoods. And as you can see, there's many arrows going to this risk. So it's from almost all the impact transmission systems. And those risks can be for like on the health of indigenous people, can also be on the water and food security, and even also on their culture and traditional livelihoods. So this is one of the main risks in the Arctic. And since indigenous people, like I said, are cross-state, it is a cross-border risk. We then have the risk of migration of population because of melting glaciers in the Arctic that cause quite a good proportion of sea level rise globally. And finally, we have two risks linked to Arctic sea ice retreat that make resources in the Arctic more accessible, such as mining, tourism, fishing in the central Arctic Ocean, for example. And we also have new shipping lanes. And so this creates first a risk to security with a militarization of the Arctic. And finally, it also creates a risk on trade with those new possibilities of resources and commodities, creating global change in trade, or having the potential to do it anyway. But so this figure was just too simple at the moment, so we added other arrows, and those represent kind of an intensification of the impacts with each other. And so if we look on the left side of the figure, we can see, for example, that increased rainfall causes a melting of the ice, and so it impacts the melting glaciers and Arctic sea ice retreat. And we also have a positive feedback between warming and most of those initial impacts. So warming is intensified by those initial impacts. But now if we look at the right side of the figure, we can try to answer our second question, which is what policy response needs do those impact transmission system create in the short and medium long term? So once again, on the short term, we can look at the amount of arrows and see that risks for indigenous people livelihoods is really the main policy response needs in the short term, because on top of all the risks that we've already mentioned, almost all the cross-border risks also intensify or generate risks for indigenous people. Then we can also see that there are interactions between the risk to energy and transport infrastructure, the security risk, and the trade risk. So all three of those are connected, and they have a lot of policy domains related to them. And looking at the coherence between those policy domains is very important, and it is a policy response need in the medium long term, or at least I think. So we come now to our last question, which is why are horizontal and cross-border policy coherence issues related to climate change important? So first, once again, let's explain what is horizontal and cross-border coherence. So horizontal coherence, as you can see here, for example, is the coherence between climate policy and other policy domain of the same region. And you want them to be coherent in order that the climate policy that tackle climate change does not have other objectives in other policy domains that actually hinder this response. And similarly, cross-border coherence, which is a term that we also really kind of created within Cascades, looks at the climate policy of regions where the impacts are transmitted and the climate policy of recipient region. And since they address the same impact or the same risk, they also need to be coherent. So why is this important? Well, first, because issues of coherence can allow us to see what is missing in the policy response. And in the Arctic, the main coherence issues are the following. So we first have a lack of consideration of climate change interactions. And here is a quote from 2005, which I think is still relevant today. And that is that Arctic policies are created to pay attention to a range of discrete, largely non-overlapping issues. And this first point is also intensified by the fact that the sea ice retreat providing new opportunities for cross-border shipping and exploitation of resources attract non-Arctic players, and those new players might once again not consider the climate change interactions when they only look at economic opportunities. Then we have the colonialism of the Arctic and the lack of consideration of indigenous people, which we already really emphasized in our previous slide. And those can be seen in conflicting objectives with strategies that encourage exploitation of natural resources instead of maybe supporting more the adaptation of traditional livelihoods. And finally, we also have conflicting actions on the infrastructures in the Arctic, with a lack of adaptation to secure the vulnerable infrastructure of permafrost thaw, for example, and instead the building of new infrastructure for increased exploitation and sea traffic. So then, now that we identified those incoherence, we can also see missing policy connections across borders. And the first one is, again, related to the cross-border identity of indigenous people and the fact that policies of nation states have until recently not really considered it. Arctic resources are also regulated mostly at the national level, and to be able to answer those cross-border impacts, it might make the systematic coordination quite limited. Then more on the governance, and coming back to my quote on the fact that Arctic policies are generally non-overlapping, the Arctic Council does not really have a formal regulatory mandate to cope with cross-border impacts, and it really depends on consensus between the different Arctic states. And finally, the lack of trust caused by Russia's attack on Ukraine has really effectively closed the possibility of discussions on cross-border Arctic security and defense and their links to climate change. So to really conclude on this case study, which is really quite full of information, I have 4 points really for you to take home. And so the first one is that in the Arctic, global changes have local impacts and local changes have global impacts. And so we need to strengthen the policy coherence, and for that to happen, we need all policy domains to increase their awareness of the potential cross-border impacts of climate change. The Arctic complexity is also increased due to the presence of indigenous communities that require specific policy elements to support participatory adaptation across borders. And finally, even though policy coherence is great in allowing us to see different issues in the policy response, it cannot solve the fundamental issue of who owns the Arctic. And this will be a challenge for all policies attempting to address cross-border impacts of climate change. So this was all from me. So thanks a lot for your attention on this presentation. So we will now move to the panel discussion that will be moderated by Charles Emerson, who is a historian as well as a former senior research fellow at Chatham House and the author of a book on the Arctic called The Future History of the Arctic. So Charles, I hand over to you for the discussion, and I will stay here to answer any questions on this presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire. That was a really fascinating and very, very rich presentation. I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss, and we'll come back to you. In just a second, I'm going to open it up to our panel of Ada Ayaydin, who's a fellow at the University of London in Paris, Miguel, who is an international relations officer at the European Commission in Brussels, and Bruce Forbes, who is a professor in global change up in Rovaniemi, at the Arctic Center at the University of Lapland. But I'm just going to start with just a couple of comments and a question for you, Claire, which might help to sort of begin to open things up. One thing I really enjoyed about your presentation was the way in which you highlighted something which is so essential about the Arctic and fascinating about it, which is the way in which the Arctic is both a subject of global change and, crucially, a place where global change is actually forged. And I think that's such an important element for us to consider as we think about the Arctic. I was intrigued by the word cascade, which implies a sort of vertical process, because in a way, things you were describing were really more of an interplay between a wide range of factors: environmental, economic, political, and geopolitical. And of course, some of those factors are determined at a very high level, even a global level, but others are not. And I guess that question of level, how we respond to these, is very interesting, and a variety of actions and actors are needed with different interests. And I think that's another really important political point to bring out. 10 years ago, when I wrote The Future History of the Arctic, which seems really a lifetime ago in some respects now, I was kind of battling a series of misconceptions and prejudices about the Arctic, one of which was, of course, the idea of the Arctic as a kind of blank page, a sort of fantasy land on which people could, outside the Arctic, could project their dreams and visions. And now I think that's still relevant to some degree, but I don't think now we could possibly question the importance of the Arctic in a global sense. And some of the changes that we were looking at then have really come to pass. Looking at the news just the other day and seeing a hydrocarbon cargo traveling from the Russian Arctic to China reminds us of the incredible salience of these issues and how climate, environment, and geopolitics interrelate. My question for you, Claire, before we open it up, is really about timelines. Because one thing I find very interesting in your presentation is there's a huge web of interconnections. But of course, some of these issues play out in the short term, some play out in the long term. Some policy responses are short term, some policy responses have a very long-term impact. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you incorporate those into your thinking.
Okay, well, this is quite a good question, and also I don't know if we really thought much about the timeline, because it is so hard to really know like what will happen in the Arctic in the future, really. So that's why kind of the only answer I could have in terms of timeline is really the urgency of maybe dealing with the adaptation of the people in the Arctic. And then in terms of like the consequences and impacts outside of the Arctic, I can't really say like which timeline we're going to have. But then in terms of the impacts in the Arctic, the blue box here, I think that most of them are already very much happening. But it's true that we could imagine this figure made more in terms of which one of those impacts are already happening now, which ones are expecting in the future, and which one are the most relevant in that kind of context. But yeah, for now I can't really give more of this answer, and I hope that already gave a bit of information. Yeah. Thank
you very much indeed, Claire. Well, maybe that scenario thinking or something like that can lead you in that direction. I don't know.
Yeah.
Could I turn first to Ada Ayaydin, who's joining us from Paris, and her research is particularly in the field of Arctic sovereignty, science diplomacy, governance, and Sami political representation. I wondered if you could talk a little bit, Ada, about your work and about how you see it tallying with what Claire has presented.
Thank you, Charles. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with great experts here. So I'm teaching fellow at the University of London Institute in Paris. I'm a political scientist, and my approach bases on international perspective. So I work on sovereignty issues, sovereignty in the Arctic, especially the relation between Norway and Russia. And in my research, I touch upon also to environmental sovereignty. Actually, this idea, environmental sovereignty, emerged by last year's Russia's attitude at COP26. So the president of Russia didn't participate in the COP, but Russia organized Arctic Days in the Russian pavilion, or wherever it was, as the chair of the Arctic Council. And one of my Norwegian official contacts called this Arctic COP of Russia. So this was a great example to the environmental sovereigntism by Russia. Like it was a sincere like Arctic COP, or like it was just a show of the like limits to environmental commitments. So, however, as the theme of this panel, like climate change is a cross-border reality. And like greenhouse gases have nothing to do with sovereign states or sovereign national borders, right? And on the other hand, when we talk about sovereignty in the Arctic, of course, indigenous sovereignty and land rights questions emerge. And this is like Arctic is home to several indigenous groups, and they're affected at most by climate's cross-border effects. There are physical changes and effects, but also cultural impacts of these cross-borders issues. So all these effects are fragmented. There are several layers, such as permafrost, thaw, unpredictable environmental conditions, etc. So these communities have traditional knowledge, which is a valuable tool to deal with climate change. However, the cooperation between indigenous peoples is affected by politics. For example, today, the cross-border cooperation between Sami people is impacted by sanctions. They suffer in terms of lack of land rights in their respective countries, but also they are directly affected by politics, while their knowledge is an important, significant tool for climate works. Bruce will elaborate probably this traditional knowledge better than me, but I just want to say that the states are very visible in all layers of climate works. As Claire just mentioned in her presentation, the horizontal coherence as the coherence between climate policy and other policies. Like, so is it the case really? For example, in my case, Norway just, declared that they target 55% reduction in emissions, but in the same time, they increase their drilling in the Arctic. So I can just finish by underlining that at least in my case, there is still way to this coherence. So I stop here and maybe I can elaborate more with questions.
Thank you very much, Ada. I have a quick follow-up question for you, which is, we've seen, of course, the Arctic Council has sort of more or less gone into the deep freeze over the last period of time. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about whether there are other formats which are emerging, or which might emerge in your view, which could allow that spirit of cooperation, which was very present previously, where the Arctic was it was a zone where generally there was cooperation despite geopolitical tensions. Do you see other formats where cooperation may emerge? And also, do you see ways for the indigenous populations of the Arctic to become more sort of structurally engaged or present? Because of course, the Arctic Council was one place where that did happen.
Yeah, first of all, I want to underline as well that when Arctic Council suspended this cooperation, let's say its work, they didn't consult the indigenous peoples. Even indigenous peoples are the permanent members of the Arctic Council. Like, this was very important. So we see, okay, permanent members, when you look at the permanent members, after states, we have also other organizations, but states are main actors. Unfortunately, nation state is also still very visible in the Arctic Council work. And as soon as I went to the field this summer, and actually I was still there, and they couldn't, they insisted on the role of Arctic Council. And also one of my, official contact told me that we have enough tools in the Arctic, enough tools, enough governance mechanisms. We don't need any extra mechanisms, but we have to use them efficiently. Like this is the case. The question is, do we use them efficiently or no? But the question again here, you are just living behind the biggest territory in the Arctic, biggest territory in the world, and most populated, indigenous, in terms of indigenous peoples behind. And this is a big responsibility in terms of climate change works, I guess.
Thank you very much, Ada. I think we'll now move on to Miguel, and indeed to a non-state player in the Arctic, and of course an observer at the Arctic Council, which is the European Union. And I'd like it very much if Miguel could talk to us a bit about the evolving European Union policy in the Arctic, and how at different levels the European Union is engaging with these very relevant issues which have been brought up by our previous speakers. Miguel.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. And good morning from my side, from Brussels in Belgium, the headquarters of the European Union. So my name is Miguel Roncero, and I work in the Director General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries in the unit dealing with ocean governance, law of the sea, and Arctic policy. And the Arctic has been an issue for the European Union for many years. The first communication was first published by the Commission on the Arctic was published in 2008, and there has been updates in 2012, 2016, and the latest in 2021. This shows really more than 10 years of engagement and commitment, and also of progressive learning and engagement of the European Union. The 2021 update took place in October, 13th of October, so a little bit over a year ago, has three main focuses, three main pillars. This document first was updated because of the need to address geopolitical and climate developments since 2016, and with a strong focus on this coherence that Claire mentioned, that she referred to in her presentation. So the updated 2021 EU Arctic policy focuses on promoting, on helping to ensure that the Arctic is a peaceful and constructive region where dialogue and cooperation takes place, so the Arctic remains safe and stable. It also focuses on addressing the different challenges that the Arctic is facing, and as it was well mentioned, things that happen in the Arctic do not remain in the Arctic, and vice versa. So addressing the different ecological, social, economic, political challenges linked to climate change, environmental degradation. And last but not least, to promote inclusive and sustainable development in the Arctic, for the Arctic, and to the benefit of those living in the Arctic as well as future generations. So this is the 2021 update of the EU Arctic policy, and on this one I would like to mention that the EU is active in the Arctic. Well, there are different Arctics. This would be the first thing I would like to mention. There is perhaps the clear division in terms of geography. We have a North American Arctic, a more European Arctic that includes part of Russia, and the more Eurasian, Asian Arctic. But there are also different Arctics in terms of socioeconomic groups, in terms of urban, rural areas. So we don't need to just look at the Arctic as one box, whatever that box is that we imagine the Arctic to be, but we need to be very conscious that there are many different geographic, social, economic Arctics there. And this is also something that we take into consideration in the EU Arctic policy. So we are following a whole of the government approach, if we can put it that way. But basically, what Claire was mentioning in terms of connecting the different policy areas. So at the heart of the EU Arctic policy, you have the European Green Deal, which is one of the driving elements of the European actions. Which are also connected with different strategies, different other policies. You have the biodiversity strategy, for example, that is also at the core. You have blue economy development. You have the different work that the EU is doing with indigenous peoples. You have, at the same time, now going a little bit more in this regional division, you have areas of the Arctic, northern Sweden, northern Finland, which are part of the European Union, where citizens living there are also EU citizens, and where you have all the rights, privileges, actions, everything that the European Union is doing takes place in these areas. At the same time, you have other Arctic areas in northern Norway, in Iceland. These countries are part of the European Economic Area, part of the internal market. So the EU presence there, even if might not be 100% seen every day, is definitely felt through the internal market and through the Schengen area, of course, and so on. And of course, the EU as a global player, as a global player in the so-called soft security aspects, so also exerts a high degree, a high level of influence in globally in different areas that also have an impact and translate in North America, so the Canadian Arctic, Alaska, as well as in Russia. I think I can stop here, Charles, and we can, because I could really continue talking about this for many minutes. So I think it's best if I stop here. Yeah.
Well, Miguel, maybe I could come back briefly with one point, which I've always found very interesting and intriguing. Of course, you're talking from the European Commission headquarters, as you said, in Brussels. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the differences of approach of different European Union states and their different levels of interest in Arctic issues, and how you see that playing out. And that's my first question to you. And the second one is how have things shifted since February 2022? Of course, now Sweden and Finland have joined, are in the process of joining NATO. and so European Union members joining NATO. And that seems to have changed very much the level of different discussions in the Arctic. Maybe the security issues are now higher up the agenda than they might have been a year ago. And again, I just wondered how the European Union was responding to that shift, that institutional shift, and perhaps also that shift in focus of European Arctic countries.
Thanks, thank you, Charles. And I'll start with the second question. Obviously, a lot of things have changed since February 2022, since the illegal and unjustified Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that has also clearly, evidently impacted the Arctic. Arctic cooperation, international cooperation, as well as scientific, on the ground work in different areas that could be cross-border cooperation, could be simply families at different sides of different borders, being able to see each other. So this is different aspects here from science research, innovation to very human stories and as well to high politics. Now, we have a situation where the 2021 update of the EU Arctic policy has a strong geopolitical component. So this is the first time that in one of in updating our documents we have a very strong geopolitical component that is well reflected. Of course, in October 2021, no one could foresee, or some people foresaw, but the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine are not reflected in the 2021 document of the EU. That is clear. The situation we have right now is of halting all activities with Russia, with Russian nationals, with Russian institutions. This is, of course, in a time where Russia had taken over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, quite unfortunate because many things that would have normally happened under the Arctic Council in this year have not happened. But at the same time, as you rightly mentioned, Charles, we have now Finland and Sweden, 2 EU member states, Arctic states that will probably soon become NATO countries. So in this sense, the NATO in the Arctic in Europe and the EU become a little bit more even interconnected in that sense. So there is also an additional need to address this. February changes, unfortunately, in the short term, a narrative more towards hard security elements. And unfortunately, in the sense that it's not because it's unnecessary, quite the opposite. But at the same time, these efforts divert attention from the long-term goals, the long-term objectives of fighting, adapting, and mitigating climate change. Because we maintain, as we say in the 2021 update, that the biggest threat to the Arctic, not only to the Arctic, to people everywhere, but in this case in the Arctic, is and remains is climate change and remains to be climate change. So in that sense, this is for us the main focus, and again acknowledging and recognizing the relevance and the need to address the more traditional security challenges in the short term. We must not forget or stop looking at the long term, and that the big problem that we have already been felt in the Arctic, in Europe. We saw it this summer, we saw it this October, being the hottest in record in many places in Europe, is climate change. Now, coming to a little bit the coordination between the EU and the different EU Arctic states, different levels. Just to clarify one thing, Charles, you opened mentioning that the EU is an observer in the Arctic Council. We are an aspiring observer, not fully acknowledged as such yet, but we basically have the same work and we perform some activities as if we were a full observer, but just to clarify that. So the EU, together with the EU Arctic states, but also the Arctic, the EU countries that are Arctic observers, but not part of the Arctic. So it could be Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Poland, the Netherlands, for example. We have coordination amongst ourselves. So there is a higher degree of coordination with 3 EU Arctic states, or the 3 member states that are part of the Arctic Council, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark. But we are also in contact regularly with the other countries on different areas. For example, Germany, France are really well active in research and innovation. But with Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, we speak regularly on all aspects related to the Arctic. And to add as well that this EU Arctic policy, the one we have in 2021 as well as we had before, but with example of the one we published in 2021, went through a lengthy, very deep and really positive consultation process. So the three EU Arctic member states are well aware not only of what's there, but also have influenced the content to which they all agree. So in this sense, we have a coordination where we have to obviously take into consideration the competences. The EU is a beast in that sense, with different competences at different levels that we observe, but we have a very good cooperation and coordination. And again, I should stop here because I could keep going for a while.
Thank you very much indeed, Miguel. I think it's very interesting to see how many of these Arctic issues, which previously Arctic members of the European Union were trying to get other European countries interested in Arctic issues. Now they don't need to work so hard, perhaps. But you've raised a very interesting and important question, which is how do elements of global cooperation, which are essential, have they become a lot harder since February 2022? And at this point, I'd like to bring in Bruce, who is Professor of Global Change at the Arctic Centre at the University of Lapland, and has a background in fieldwork in the Arctic for the last 35 years in applied ecology, geography, encompassing studies of permafrost and a whole range of other things, with a very interesting on-the-ground perspective. Bruce, I wondered if you could talk about, first of all, what you've heard. And I understand that you are the coordinator of a project called Charter, which has a strong Russian footprint. And perhaps you could talk about how things have evolved in the way in which that project works. And you can help us understand how much things have shifted over the last year or so. So Bruce, can I open it to you?
Sure. Yeah, actually in Claire's talk and your follow-up to her, you were also talking about the timescales, and it'll soon be 38 years I've been working in the Arctic. So I look at it kind of different decades, how they stand out. And what I originally went up to then Soviet Union to look at in West Siberia was the oil and gas development, and working with indigenous tundra nomads, Nenets, reindeer herders. And what they were interested in then was whether Gazprom and Lukoil and the Nenets were going to keep their promises of mutual coexistence, which was the rhetoric of Arctic development in Soviet areas then. But then over the last 10, 15 years, climate change in the form of extreme weather began to ramp up. And I've noticed in the media, going back to Arctic climate impact assessment, the kind of temperate European and world perspective has been to focus on warmer summers and heat waves. But when we're there, people were worried not only about that, but also about the warming winters and what that brought. And one of the first things that people brought to my attention was increasing shrub growth, or tundra greening was affecting both sides of the Ural Mountains for nomadic herders. And then, in the mid-2000s, they had started having massive rain on snow events. That's rain falling on a snow cover in the winter, or bare ground with snow coming later in the winter, and then freezing, going down to normal winter temperatures of -40 in West Siberia, and you'd end up with a hard crust of snow that the reindeer cannot penetrate to get to their fodder. So that, it doesn't mean the oil and gas went away, it just meant that the issues changed. And Edo was talking about the Sami situation. Living here at the Arctic Circle, I'm working also with indigenous Sami reindeer herders in the Nordic countries. The issues have also evolved. When I came up here in 1994, started talking to herders, the issues were dysfunctional reindeer governance. They didn't have a role, they didn't have a say, and they were very concerned about that because it was top-down state level management, told how many reindeer you can have in this area, how much they need to weigh, so on and so forth. And then along came Arctic climate impact assessment in 2004-05, and the whole lens kind of shifted over wholesale to climate issues. but the dysfunctional governance didn't go away. So again, people tend to focus on a lot what the media presents, and being here in Finland 28 years, the southern Finnish perspective tends to be that reindeer are there as to produce meat. It's seen more here as a cultural livelihood. It's something you're proud of. It's something you want to teach your children, and you want the traditions to continue. And yes, we have both ethnic and Finnish Sami herders. Sami are the clear minority here, but the issues have also evolved here. One thing that is very cross-border, which I already mentioned, is for one, summer, the heat waves, the drying up of wetlands, the increase in shrub growth, but also the warmer winters. Here in Rovaniemi, which lives on winter tourism, the home of Santa Claus, when the rivers aren't frozen, I'm looking out at the Ounasjoki and the Kemijoki River from my office window. When they are not frozen at Christmas, people start canceling their holidays from Paris and Manchester and so on. And when Corona hit, it hit everybody hard, but nobody can make a living reindeer herding anymore. All the Sami herders I deal with do supplemental income like tourism, guiding for fishing and so on. So when Corona hit and tourists were sent home, it hit people hard. And last point, as you mentioned about, working in Russia and leading a large consortium project. We have 21 partners in the Charter project spread across 9 European countries, but we also partner with Russia and China, and that was already difficult during Corona. The first 2 years, field work became impossible. And now with the war, since February 22nd, 24th, now we have big problems. So we expend a lot of effort trying to grapple with those issues and how research will continue in this kind of environment. Because again, even though the war is going on and Corona keeps popping up, the dysfunctional governance here in Fennoscandia for reindeer governance, the oil and gas development, those issues don't go away. They just become more complex. So it's these, in my almost 4 decades of Arctic research now, these issues evolve, and we have to keep evolving with the complexity. Research has to continue. We can't ignore the complexity. We have to keep grappling with it. And that's why hats off to the EU for funding these types of projects and recognizing how many different partners and disciplines you need to tackle the kinds of issues I was just raising. And thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here and hearing these presentations, and finally meeting Edda, who I follow on Twitter for a long time, and very interesting group here. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Bruce. I should just want to remind our audience that if they do have questions which they want to ask of our panelists, they can do so. I believe there's a bar on the right-hand panel where they're able to do that. And if they do have questions, then I can try and integrate those into our conversation. I did have a follow-up question for you, Bruce, which is, although we're looking very much at sort of institutional level cooperation, and how that maybe has shifted or become more complicated over the last period. But I assume, but maybe you can help me understand, have you been able to maintain person-to-person relationships? And has that provided a way for a sort of shadow cooperation to continue, even if institutional corporations become more tricky?
You mean cross-border with Russia?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I was in a polar symposium in Monaco, hosted by Prince Albert II on the day the war began. So there were the heads of all the polar research institutes. So Antje from Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany, North Polar Institute, IARC in Alaska, Emily from British Antarctic Survey. They were all sitting there in a panel like this on the stage. And the response was very quick and very severe in terms of cutting all contacts officially. the thing is, Charter was built on existing data sets. We have so many projects with limited timescales of 3, 4, or if you're lucky, 5 years. And then the postdocs and early career people move on to another project, and a lot of the data never gets actually analyzed, and it never gets published, much less up to the policy-making level. So we designed a charter to work mainly with existing data sets, and that helped us a lot because we didn't have any signatory partners from Russia. All our partners were European. The Russian and Chinese partners were affiliates, so we didn't have to drop any partners. But in answer to your question, we're fortunate that we have, for example, partners in European institutes with Russian nationality, and they're able to come here to Rovaniemi. They're also able to work with their existing data. So we are making clear progress. It hit me as I'm a kind of natural scientist background, but working with social scientists and indigenous peoples my whole career. But I was supposed to take 2 different expeditions to the Yamal Peninsula this year after 2 years delay of Corona. And one expedition going with 13 people by helicopter to one area, another one going by train and boat to another area. So that's been hit hard because those were multinational teams with German, American, Swedish, Finnish, and Russian partners, and those can't go on. But the existing data we are still working with, and as probably those of you like Etta and Claire, you know that these projects, that when they're done, the data is there's still a lot of data still to deal with. So that's how we're treating the Russia situation. Is we've have a lot of permafrost data. We have a lot of embedded social anthropological data from participant observation that's gone on for years. So we are actually in a good position, and we just went through our 18-month review process with the EU, and we came out of that very well.
That's reassuring to hear, Bruce. I was interested, you spoke a lot about how oil and gas used to be very much the focus of the Arctic. And indeed, when I was writing the future history of the Arctic, that was, the oil price was as high as it is today, and that was very much one of the issues. My personal hunch is that actually the time when the Arctic might become this sort of oil and gas bonanza zone, which for some people was a dream and other people was a nightmare. My sense is that the world is moving so fast towards a green revolution, or through a green revolution. And indeed, the complex geopolitics relating to the war in Ukraine and sanctions, etc., may mean that actually that's not going to happen. So that sort of, well, for some people was a dream and other people a nightmare. I think that the Arctic is not going to go down that pathway, which seemed a quite likely scenario 10 years ago. I'm gonna return to all the members of the panel, and we've spoken a lot about cooperation and about the interrelationship of all these different issues, and that wonderful diagram which Claire presented at the very beginning, which I think you'll have lots of people poring over for days afterwards. But I wanted to come back to you all and ask you, what is the one thing, the one Arctic issue, the area of cooperation, or the one issue which you feel is not getting enough attention and which needs to? What's the one thing which has you sort of waking up in the middle of the night screaming and thinking, look, why aren't people dealing with this? So if I could turn, maybe I don't know if Claire is able to come back on that herself, but if not, maybe if I could turn first to Ada and ask her what issue she finds most perplexing and most urgent right now.
Is it me or Claire should go first? I don't know.
Go ahead, and I'll go after you.
Okay, I guess like in terms of climate change and like all this in works, we saw that like oil and gas production and drilling has the most effect in this increase of greenhouse gases, etc. That's why actually That's why, but also to eliminate Russian gas, they try to accelerate green transition and green mining in the Arctic. Like this is packed over there, but it's also Pandora box over there. Like, what is that? What is green mining in the Arctic? Is it really green? Like, this is the question. Actually, we should dig a little bit more, because when you go to these big Arctic conferences today, they just focus on new economic activities in the Arctic, like, you know, green mining, green economy, blue economy, etc. I guess there is a urgent, let's say, attention. We need this, like, you know, is it really green and blue, or it is really, how can I say, good for the Arctic and for the people? Because it is in the same time, it shouldn't mean in the same time green colonialism. For all those people living in the Arctic, because, like, you know, all those people living in the same area, like all will be, this green mining will be. So I guess there is an urgent attention to this topic, because it sounds and it looks so great, green mining.
Okay, so we need to always be very cautious of any word which just where you put green at the front of it or blue at the front of it, and suddenly it's turned from being a bad thing to a good thing. Of course, Claire, can I ask you what you know? Of course, a lot of your work is about these interconnections. But what's the one thing which really stands out for you?
Well, I mean, like I think I already really mentioned in the presentation, and joining EDA, I think being aware of the people in the Arctic that are the most impacted by anything that happens there and outside of the Arctic is really the most important thing. And it's usually recognized, you know, like I've read, I don't know how many research articles for this case study, and in all of them it's really emphasized, oh, it impacts indigenous people, but there's not really much actions really that I've witnessed that help them adapt, and so that's also what I was trying to really show in that figure, so that it was really central that everything, like all the connections in the end, related to them. So yeah, for me, that's the main thing that makes me scream, wake up screaming at night, like you said. So
we've got a couple of questions from the audience. So if I could just turn quickly to Miguel and Bruce, what's the one thing that keeps them awake at night, and then I'll turn to a couple of questions from the audience. So sorry, first to Miguel.
Yeah, to me, the key element that doesn't, you know, receive as much attention as I would personally like you know, people to pay attention to is the human aspect of the Arctic. You know, if you Google Arctic, you're going to get first, you know, go to images, you're going to get polar bears, icebergs, and whatnot. You are not going to really get people. And, you know, no matter what definition you take, no matter how you understand the Arctic to be, there is hundreds of thousands, millions of people living in the Arctic. People who have legitimate aspirations in terms of well-being, prosperity, in terms of rights, in terms of being heard, this being for both indigenous populations and non-indigenous people living in the Arctic. So it's basically their well-being, the need for certain services, infrastructures to be there, for them to acquire a standard that is a legitimate aspiration, and, you know, to have the same elements that we can aspire to have anywhere else in the world, from, you know, job security to you know, certain leisure activities. It's not only about, you know, jobs in the Arctic. It's also about having fun in the Arctic, in the sense that, you know, you have your job 9 to 5, what you do afterwards. The Arctic needs to be attractive in that sense. So it's about who lives in the Arctic and you know, their aspirations and their well-being, their prosperity. And basically, this is the element that to me has, you know, there is some attention being paid to this, but not enough. There is quite a lot of focus on other areas. And this, in any case, connects with all the big elements. Well-being is connected to health, which is connected to climate change, which is, you know, infrastructure is connected to climate change, and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, it is really the human impact of the big aspects that we are looking into.
Thank you very much indeed, Miguel. And very briefly, Bruce, what's the one thing you think that we should be talking about, which we're not talking about?
Well, it gets talked about, but we're not living up to it, is the COP21, you know, Paris Agreement, keeping the Arctic at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius in the areas I was mentioning, West Siberia, it's already plus 4 degrees warmer. So I work on the adaptation side. I can't do everything. I don't work with attribution, but we know what is causing the problem. We're just not doing enough to keep the carbon and methane emissions down.
Well, I'm going to turn on that very point. In fact, I'm going to turn to a couple of questions which have risen from the audience. And they come into, it's basically in two groups. One is a question mostly about the natural sciences and about climate change, and one is more about politics, but it touches on these. So the first question is about what we know that the Arctic will continue to warm even if we stop emitting greenhouse gases tomorrow. But what are the most effective? This is a question to Claire and to Bruce, and maybe first to Bruce. What are the most effective practical adaptation approaches for communities in the Arctic that we need to be considering? So maybe if Bruce and then Claire could answer that question, and then we have a political question. This may be your last chance to say anything very important, so bear that in mind.
Well, I go back to what Edda was saying earlier. There's a term up here, at least we call it green painting, when companies and institutions say, I mean, I lived through the 1990s working in Siberia, and British Petroleum was still there, and they rebranded themselves as Beyond Petroleum, you know, BP with a new logo. But, you know, we have to be careful about what is window dressing and what is practical. And in our EU project, we just had our General Assembly in Hamburg so that most partners could get there by train and not have to hop on a plane or two to get there. So I think we do have to think globally and act locally. Individual actions do matter.
Thank you. And Claire, could I ask you what you think are the most effective practical adaptation approaches for Arctic communities that you've come across in your work?
I guess, I mean, what I've read the most about, because I think out of all our panelists, I'm the one that's the most recently worked on the Arctic. I mean, like, not for a very long time. But I think what I've seen and read is really to include Indigenous people and ask them what, like, their adaptation practice, because they have been living in the Arctic for a very long time, and they know what to do to adapt. And so including this knowledge in any policies that relate to the Arctic will definitely help on the adaptation side of climate change. And then, yeah, I don't have an answer in terms of the point of Bruce and how to maybe reduce the emissions if you want to keep economic development to happen in the Arctic. But yeah, that's my short answer.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm just going to turn this, there's a final couple of political questions, which I'm going to turn over to Ada and Miguel. And one is something we haven't really spoken about, which is the question of China's increasing interest and prevalence in the Arctic, and how this is affecting the way that we think about policy. Some people have said that China's interest in the Arctic is kind of overblown. It's used as a sort of scare tactic in some cases. But I imagine it is real, and it does have impact on Arctic policy. And the second question from Takima Kodongul from the University of Strasbourg, it relates to the Arctic Council and Indigenous peoples. And this was a transnational institution where Samis could be heard at the international level. Was it a mistake to cease cooperation in that body? And if so, could it be restarted? So those are these two political questions which I'd like to turn over to Ada and Miguel. These will be the final questions we can answer in this session.
Okay, thank you, Charles. So about China, I mean, I'm not expert in Chinese politics, but like China claimed that they're very interested in climate work in the Arctic. That's why the Arctic was important for China. But of course, we know that the resources and shipping routes, etc., it is very important. And as China identifies itself as a near Arctic nation, so it is important. And like, but by the big decision, like, you know, in this like 7+1 model of Arctic Council, we just put or left Russia and China alone in the other side, and they're the biggest emitters. Let's say one of the biggest emitters in the world. So I guess in here overall, the important thing is to put the environmental justice or climate change in the focus point is very important, like in the Arctic Council, where I guess. And about the Sami question is a big question, especially in Finnish case, because I lived in Finland when I was young. I just did my research internship at the Arctic Center as well. So yeah, I lived with the Sami family. That's why I'm very familiar with the problems. And today, actually, in Finland, it's a very political questions, and the young activists always, talk about this, and they are waiting for Sanna Marin today to bring the Sami Parliament Act to Parliament and approve. And actually, I guess time is like, it should be approved like, in a close time. So I guess this is very important. I mean, Arctic Council has a role to bring the visibility of Sami people or indigenous peoples, but in their respective countries, like they have to be given their land rights as well, or they have to be heard. I guess this is very important for the livelihood of these peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ada, and thank you very much to James Bacon of the Met Office and Samim Akgonul for that question regarding the Arctic Council. I just want to briefly ask Miguel if he's got any final comments, and then I'll turn it over to Claire to wrap up. So first, Miguel.
Thank you. Just very briefly, and maybe starting with the issue of the Sami. Well, there is really bright, very smart people working in the Sami Council, and they have used this, this let's call it pause time in the Arctic Council to do many other things to make the voices being heard, for sure at the European level, also internationally. So even though perhaps the pausing of activities in the Arctic Council might have affected the permanent representatives, including the Sami Council. With example of the Sami Council, they have not been sitting down, just rolling their thumbs. They have been quite active, and they have taken advantage of this time. So in this sense, yeah, I cannot tell whether this was or not a mistake, but for sure they have used the time very, very actively. On China, just to finalize this, of course, well, the EU has been trying to enhance its strategic autonomy since the pandemic, since COVID, when we saw that over-reliance on any country, that might also be affected on its own by, in this case, was the pandemic, was not good, and therefore that the EU needed to enhance its strategic autonomy. When it comes to China and the Arctic, of course, we see China as a legitimate global actor, is a rising power with interests. So as long as, it's clear that there is genuine interest to, achieve cooperation, to, work in partnerships that bring mutual benefit for those living in the Arctic, and of course, obviously for China. And this is obvious. Mutual benefit is to both parties. Work that brings prosperity, and again, on the basis of cooperation, mutual understanding. This is legitimate positive cooperation, but at the same time, as I mentioned, Europe has this objective, this goal of enhancing strategic autonomy, to which we the Arctic is one of the areas where the EU is again in the Arctic, but also in terms of Eda mentioned shipping, we mentioned before minerals and so on. Those are areas where certainly there is a need to also respect environmental aspects and socioeconomic aspects. And as I mentioned in my intervention before, the legitimate interest of those living in the Arctic should be first and foremost put forward. So it is for the Arctic first.
Thank you very much indeed, Miguel. I think that comes across loud and clear. That's been an absolutely fascinating session, very, very illuminating. Thank you so much to Ada, Miguel, Bruce, and Claire. And I'd like to pass it over to Claire to close up this session. And thank you very much again.
Yes, so thanks to all of you. It's been really great. I agree with Charles that this was extremely interesting to me, and I hope to our audience. So thank you all for participating and listening in to this session. And so the COP27 virtual pavilion for the Cascades project work continues in 30 minutes on trade. So the next session will be the transmission of climate impacts through international trade and the implications for the EU. So if you're interested, stick around, and in 30 minutes, this will start again with this new subject. So thank you all for participating, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.